Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, Part 31. I'd like to wish you all a happy solstice today. I'm also told that there is a lunar eclipse, so that's something to keep your eyes peeled for. Alright, so today I would like to do a little retrospection on the centuries leading up to where we're currently at in our chronology, and that's to take some time and talk about quote-unquote Asiatic religion. We covered this a little bit, especially in regards to Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, but obviously this is a massive subject, and Asia is home to a countless number of traditions, which today in the Angloid world we very conveniently have monolithic names with which to paint ourselves some sort of epistemological cartoon of reality. We tend to simplify things with words and lose sight of reality when we say, oh, they're Shinto, or they're Hindu, or they're Taoists. And I want to explore this oversight for a minute just before moving on. Just as it was in the quote-unquote West throughout antiquity, syncretism has always been a strong component of Oriental religions. Hinduism emerged from and ultimately meshed well with animism and shamanism. Buddhism emerged from Hinduism and ultimately meshed well with Taoism, Confucianism, and so forth. To talk about confessional lines, about who believed in what creed or what dogma, is really to misunderstand the organic nature of ancient religion. When you do that, you're imposing your own categories on the past, and these are based on our present situation, our present logogram, as Robert Anton Wilson would have called it. Today, we have this notion that one has to be part of a singular, exclusive, endogamous, and monotonous belief system in order to consider oneself, quote-unquote, part of a religion. You can't be a real Christian today in most people's eyes if you don't go to church and happen to also consider the writings of the Zoroaster sacred. You can't be a real Jew if you didn't have a bar mitzvah and you also happen to keep an idol in your closet. No, this would not look good on tax forms and government-issued censuses. You could, however, in 3rd century China, for example, be a Buddhist monk, a Confucian scholar, and a Taoist poet all at once. There's plenty of overlap between these systems, and folks back then were more likely to focus on the things that all these loosely defined systems had in common, rather than hair split over differences. Systematization, categorization, taxonomy, all these things are a Western disease, and they were brought down on Asian religion during the colonial period, essentially fabricating rigid systems overnight, and then peddling them in the West as discrete and cohesive religions. This is what's meant when people say that the West invented Hinduism. Obviously, it's not meant to say that they invented that infinitude of local gods, traditions, practices, etc. It's that they invented the labels. They cut up the territory into maps. And then in turn, those discrete labels came back to influence how people, both in the West and in the East, conceived of their own religions. In a way, as a Westerner, it's not a crazy stretch to say that Hermann Hesse played a larger part in creating the Buddhism that I understand than the writings of some, let's say, contemporary disciple of Buddha. So, what I'm trying to say before getting into this stuff any further is that our rigid categories, words like Buddhism, Hinduism, Vedic religion, etc. These can only help to provide approximations of these quote-unquote systems in people's minds. I even hesitate to say systems because that implies that they are closed off, isolated, and self-sustaining. They are not, and they never were. No religion is, nor ever was. We've got to stop thinking of religions as rigid models here and start thinking of them as living intellectual ecosystems, all interconnected with one another. Think of fields and woods and swamps and hills, and then all the various creatures which inhabit them. Some creatures use all of these ecosystems, and others prefer one or two. But there were no fences put up to isolate the creatures of this land. Now, the reason we're going to talk about some of these loosely defined groups today is because I've sort of neglected them, and we've just come to a point in our chronology where East and West have gotten hitched. I'm going to discuss how Alexander opened up the way through conquest, how he Hellenized the Middle East and even parts of India, and how this allowed for an opening up of trade routes. And with the exchange of goods comes always the exchange of ideas. If you read a Hermetic grimoire like the Picatrix, which of course wouldn't be composed for over another millennium, you'd notice that the Chaldeans, the Nabateans, the Arabs, and the Indians, especially the Indians, all play a crucial role in the formulation of quote-unquote magical thinking, just as much as do the thoughts of Plato, Aristotle, and Pythagoras. So, without making the mistake of assuming a continent like India exists in a vacuum, exists as a monolith, or exists purely insofar as it influenced the West, let's dive into some Indian religions. Now, let it be known that when we're talking about India in a historical sense, this label comprises everything now part of the modern states of Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, India, and even Tibet. I don't want to have to hear any nationalists grumbling about the nitty-gritty details of who came from where, or what country invented what, or any such nonsense. All of these states are modern creations, and for the most part, they're made up of arbitrary lines that were drawn in the sand by some sorcerous colonialists some 2 or 3 centuries ago. In any case, both the northernmost part of India and its southernmost part, Tibet and Sri Lanka, are predominantly Buddhist. In fact, most of the subcontinent at one point was Buddhist, around the time of King Ashoka, who I'll discuss. But as the centuries went on, India was mostly divided between both Islam and so-called Hinduism, which, for a lack of a better way to explain it, is roughly equivalent to that grassroots level of Greco-Roman paganism. It's a sort of infinite pastiche of local traditions. And now, something to keep in mind is that over the centuries, this diversity in Hinduism was made even stronger purely because India was so rarely unified by the rule of one single major empire. For most of its history, India was fragmented into all sorts of little states, tribal enclaves, chiefdoms, and so forth. Moreover, an added variable for generating diversity was the number of languages in this region. There were a handful of Indo-European languages in the north, and a bunch of Dravidian ones in the south. There have always been vast geological and climatological differences across India, and even these have obviously affected the diversity of religion from one region to the next. You can probably start to see why the idea of something called Hinduism is somewhat misleading. That huge assortment of myths, literature, rituals, gods, philosophies, practices, movements, aesthetic sensibilities, styles of music, etc. These can only be so loosely defined before the definition has no value. I, for one, don't have a problem with ditching the term altogether, but I don't think we'll be getting into so much detail today so as to need to ditch it. To paraphrase the words of Ninian Smart, from whom I've gathered lots of information in putting together this particular lecture, quote, "Hinduism today is now much more like the trunk of a single mighty tree, but its past is a tangle of most divergent roots." Now, in previous lectures, we've gone, in passing, over the so-called Vedic culture, whose dates are roughly between the years 3000 and 1000 BC. We've also been talking a lot about the axial age, especially in regards to Gautama Buddha. And this loosely defined period coincides with what we might call the pre-classical period of Indian history, running from about 1000 BC to about 180. During this time, we have the founding of Buddhism, the birth of Jainism from the teachings of Mahavira, the composition of the Upanishads, and the proliferation of Brahmanism, which was the chief vehicle for the spread of Sanskrit across the whole of India. Even in Buddhist circles, where people rejected the authority of the Vedic Brahmins, the language used in the composition of all their sacred texts and commentaries would be in the language of the Aryan invaders, Sanskrit. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist texts were written in Pali, and in Tibet they were written in Tibetan. These three languages are essentially our chief markers for distinguishing Indian traditions from one another. And that's a not so artificial boundary to keep in mind amidst all this variability. Okay, so we know there are an infinite number of forms of religious expression as far as India is concerned. But then, more importantly, what are some points of commonality? What do all Indians have in common in regards to religion? Let's take a look at this. On the ritual and practical dimension, it's these three following elements which seem nearly universal. These are yoga, or self-discipline, if you will, puja, it est worship, and last but not least, sacrifice. Yoga is truly an ancient practice, and I personally would argue that it is as old as language itself. As soon as language became a thing, I'd like to imagine yoga became a thing. Because it means union, and it's all about dispelling the illusion of selfhood. A very persistent illusion, which is entirely the byproduct of language. Alternatively, yoga may also have been a later byproduct of a decadent shamanism. What I mean by this is that shaman traditionally accessed the divine by means of sacred plants. Over centuries and millennia, however, they either occulted or drove their sacraments to extinction, and this led them subsequently to discover all manner of yogic techniques to quote-unquote get there on the natch. So, to fill the void where psychedelics dropped out, as the theory goes, yogic techniques were invented to emulate those states. Obviously, this too is an oversimplification, but it's definitely one possibility, and I'm well aware that the old school view is very much in disagreement with this. They like to see plant-wielding shamanism as decadent shamanism, rather than the other way around. To me, this view is silly, but whatever. In any case, for the sake of ease, let's say that traditional yoga is merely an inward search and a commitment to self-discipline, particularly in the mental sphere, but so too in the bodily sphere, which of course interpenetrate one another as categories, if they can even be said to exist at all. Everything is in your head, and your head is in everything. Now, all this recent stuff about gymnastics, what I call yoga Americana, to say nothing of aligning your chakras and loving your yoni and so forth, none of this is ancient, but it is pre-modern. They would have simply called this stuff asana, which is but one of the 8 limbs of yoga. And truth be told, it's not even one of the more important limbs. Asana means postures, and the idea is this. If you can tolerate the boredom and pain of holding a pose for an exceedingly long amount of time, then you might be able to move on to sitting zazen and meditating for hours on end without going insane. If you can handle pain, you can handle distraction, the reasoning goes. Anyhow, this isn't the place to get into yoga. I recommend Aleister Crowley's 8 lectures on yoga if you want a good Western interpretation of what yoga really is. Otherwise, just go read Patanjali. Alright, so if yoga or union is all about liberation, all about giving up the ghost and pouring out that illusory self or ego into the great oneness of Brahma, a kind of flight from the alone to the alone, then puja, or worship, is the opposite. It's focused on the I-thou construct, and it's primarily communal and public. This is where gods like Vishnu and Shiva come into play, and these are obviously but 2 among millions, 330 million to use the traditional number. For Buddhists in India, puja began with simple rituals by which Gautama Buddha might be remembered. But over the centuries, the influence of Mahayana Buddhism developed a sort of devotion or bhakti, which basically conceived of the Buddha as a sort of god. This bhakti, or path of devotion, is especially prominent in that great samvada called the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God, one of the most famous sections of the Mahabharata, one of Hinduism's most sacred texts, written sometime between the 2nd century BC and the 2nd century AD. What we do know for sure is that the Bhagavad Gita makes references to many other spiritual paths, and so it reflects a milieu where Brahmins, Buddhists, Shramanas, and Jains were all sort of competing for adherence. The Gita emerged from this whirlpool of all these great traditions, and in it, this path of bhakti is what Krishna urges Arjuna to follow after unveiling himself in his great theophany. And even before then, in verse 4.9, where he declares that those truly devoted to God, or the gods, are not reborn, but go straight to them. Which, in my mind, is just another rebirth, but what do I know? Just like in Greco-Roman paganism, there's always this sort of do ut des relationship. I give so that you might give. There's this sense of mutual devotion between God and his adherents, which brings me to my next point. Sacrifice. Now, with respects to sacrifice, we need to remember that this notion of Brahmin or priestly caste came into India from the Indo-European north. Greeks, Celts, Scandinavians, Romans, Persians, and many Indians are all tied together by their common ancestry. Along with this shared ancestry came shared values, shared traditions, shared practices. And one of the most universally attested of these throughout the Indo-European family is sacrifice. This is a communal act of ritualized murder, of quote-unquote doing the deed. It's interesting to note that there are no temples in the Vedas, and this is because these were a later development by the Brahmin class, who were chiefly valued as experts in sacrifice and ritual. Once temples began to be built, these acted as houses for the gods where rituals and sacrifices might take place. These were not churches in the way that we understand them now. Now let's remember within this context that both Buddhism and Jainism are essentially rejections of the Brahmin belief system, and thus they both rejected the notion of animal sacrifice. They did, however, practice a form of renunciation, which I suppose modern-day evangelicals would consider sacrifice, in the same way they consider tithing a sacrifice, that is, giving up something you like in order to weaken its hold on you. This is not what sacrifice meant to the ancients. This is all a purely modern ideal. Sacrifice in the ancient world was more so about communal bonding than chipping away at greed or gilding church icons. For this reason, Jain and Buddhist sacrifices, or let's say acts of renunciation, were largely confined to offerings of plants and butter. So, moving on. There's this interesting polarity at work in Indian religion, which arose between the two concepts of tapas and tantra. Tapas literally means heat, and that's in reference to the heat that is generated by the body during self-mortification, mutilation, immolation, or starvation. The manipulation of tapas is very important in Jainism, and it's something which Buddhism actually arose to combat. Buddhism is all about the middle path, not extremes. Now, Tantra, on the other hand, which basically means shortcut, is more magical and esoteric, let's say. It's all about acquiring liberation through occult means, means which can include everything from astrology to extramarital sex to meat eating and all other manners of taboo violating. This is one means through which the tantric adept proves that he's above ordinary social mores. In the words of Aleister Crowley, ordinary morality is for ordinary people. It's this sort of transvaluation we see at work in, let's say, the Ptolemaic dynasty with their incestuous marriages, with the Gnostic spermophages or fetophages who eat sperm and fetuses, or let's say with the worshippers of Kali who hang out in cremation grounds. It's all about this idea that extraordinary morality is for extraordinary people. So yeah, as we can see, even in regards to the points of commonality, we see a tension at work between various traditions. At least we can say, however, that in all Indian religions, there prevailed a strong belief in cyclical time, coupled with the notion that things typically got worse as cycles went on. Doubtless, this belief emerged from the fact that Indians were master astrologers from a very early period. As I've discussed in previous lectures, the present age is called the Kali Yuga, a time of ever-increasing chaos and evil leading toward dissolution and renewal. Time in India was conceived not merely as cyclical, though, but also eternal. The wheel of life just turns, and the only way off is through nirvana, extinction, the final blowing out of life's candle for those so weary of the world they've given up all desire and thus cease the process of transmigration. In the Jain tradition, this is called Kevala, and it roughly translates to isolation. This is not union with God, as the mystical experience is often conceived of in the West. In fact, a true Buddhist or Jain would consider the mystical experience just another part of Maya that has to be pierced through. Liberation is not communion with God. It's more like a joyous cosmic suicide. A hop, skip, and a jump off the endless wheel of suffering. So, there are a number of other dominant opinions pertinent to pre-classical Indian culture, and among these we can count the certainty in reincarnation or metempsychosis, the possibility of liberation, and the idea of an endlessly creative God who is both entirely personal and entirely impersonal. Now, how people actually act in accordance with these three things, how their ethics played out, let's talk about this. For Jains and Buddhists, there's a great deal of overlap. Much emphasis is placed on reducing or altogether eliminating harm to all living beings, and it was actually the influence from these religions which convinced most of India to become vegetarian, and not just out of necessity either, since it became a form of asceticism for many Brahmin. In the Vedic period, if you were vegetarian, it was probably because you didn't have access to meat, not because you had moral qualms. This tendency toward respecting the sanctity of all forms of life has become a sine qua non of Indian religion. To make another blanket statement, another commonality throughout much of India has been a tendency toward the ideals of asceticism, of good works, and of situational relativity. This idea that much about a person's spirituality depends on a person's lot and status in life. This is where the effects of the caste system introduced to India around 1500 BC by Indo-European invaders comes into play. In India, like in much of the Indo-European world, society was divided into three categories: priests, or Brahmin, warriors, or Kshatriyas, and artisans, Vaisyas. At a later date, after conquering numerous groups of indigenous peoples, they added a fourth class of people called the Sudras, who were essentially the working poor, and eventually a fifth class was added, the infamously labeled untouchables, who were thought to be so base that they would essentially fuck up a Brahmin's purity if they ever came into contact. Sometimes these classes are called colors, and there's a definite racial undertone to this sense. The Sanskrit-speaking, Veda-reciting Indo-Europeans, or so-called Aryans, subjugated India and set the system into play. So obviously they put themselves at the top, and it's remained this way up until today. Buddhism and Jainism, of course, didn't recognize these categories. As far as they were concerned, we're all human, and every last one of us is doomed to endless suffering until we achieve enlightenment, regardless of our status or ancestry. Distinctions such as class or race were and are explicitly banned from the Sangha, which is the word for the Buddhist monastic order of vow-taking monks. The ascetic traditions which prevailed throughout India were reformed, re-envisioned, and revitalized in this pre-classical period by Gautama Buddha and Mahavira. But they didn't convince everyone with their ways. As in Greece at the time, there were itinerant teachers with all manner of positions which challenged the minutiae of Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. There were even materialists. And these men, like materialists today, rejected all notions of transcendence, of spiritual powers, and of aspirations to holiness. Fundamentally, these were skeptics. And yes, they existed in India as well. Whether they got their ideas from Greece, I don't know. Part of me thinks it's racist to assume that Indians can figure out skepticism on their own. And then part of me thinks I have a tendency to underplay the influence Greece actually had on India. It's a real Scylla and Charybdis type of scenario. In any case, some of these wandering ascetics, not necessarily the materialist ones, but the ones who were not ultimately Brahmin, these were sometimes called Shramana. And this is actually where we get the Central Asian variants of the word shaman. I talk about this briefly in my book. Whereas Brahmin were exalted priestly figures responsible for all manner of rituals and social functions, the Shramana had basically turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. They just straight up didn't give a shit. The rules didn't apply to them because they saw through the scam that is civilization. They didn't care for bathing, wearing clothes, finding lodging or food, to say nothing of performing elaborate rituals or memorizing scripture. Some of these types wound up conceiving of stuff like breatharianism, which in its pathological sense is called inedia or anorexia nervosa, but these are modern categories. Breatharians basically claim to live purely off prana, which is breath or spirit, but it's also sometimes conceived of as light or some abstract life force. I'm not really convinced, but hey, I've seen some weird shit in my life. Others of this type would just kind of lay around and smoke charas all day, which is a strange kind of noxious mixture of cannabis, tree resin, datura, and God knows what else. In Greek, these guys were sometimes called sarmanoi, and in other cases they were called gymnosophists, or naked sages. And in any case, these really aren't strict categories. They all remind me a bit of Diogenes. I like to think how some must have been very sophisticated thinkers, while others might just have been kind of old fools totally down on their luck. And there'd really be no way to distinguish them from one another until you sat at their feet and got to know them. Now, as for the Brahmin, these men were believed to have tapped into a tradition which stretched back into mythical time, to an age of the seers who had first heard the sacred sound of the cosmos, and from them coaxed out that great authoritative collection of hymns known as the Vedas. So, if ever we want to talk about quote-unquote Hindu orthodoxy, this refers to the acceptance of the Vedas as authoritative and divine. According to the Picatrix, the name Brahmin came from some guy named Barnak al-Brahmani, but I always assumed it was etymologically linked with the word Brahma, or God with a big G. Brahmin were the driving force of creativity in India, especially in regards to art, shrines, statues, temples, and all that jazz. Their hymns take us back to an era when Aryan horse lords and chariot riders were sweeping through the plains of northern India. These Aryans dislodged the previous people, the Dasyus, who were dark-skinned people living in citadels and involved with worship of phallic idols, doubtless related to some sort of fertility cult. Penis-worshipping fertility cults were sort of the thing back in those days, before one group of folks started getting exceptionally rowdy and proud. It was the values of these foreign men, and let's not kid ourselves, it was men calling all the shots in this culture, which inspired such deities as Indra, who basically drank up lakes worth of hallucinogenic soma every day and fought endless battles against demons, demigods, anti-gods, evil men, and so forth. Over a quarter of the Vedic hymns are dedicated to Indra, this war god. Among the gods of the Vedas, there's a definite throwback to that warrior ethos, which was very much thriving in the Bronze Age. Varuna is another one of these gods, a cognate of Zeus as the old sky father who presides in judgment over the world. Varuna, like Zeus, was summed up in this idea of Rta, the sacred pattern underlying all dimensions of existence, what some might call the logos, or the rational ordering principle of the universe. His partner in governance was the god Mitra, whose name literally means contract or covenant, to use a slightly more loaded term. And I don't want to get into too much detail regarding the specific parallels between Greek and Indian divinities. I just wanted to point out that they're there if you want to go look into them. Now, this is just an aside because I've seen people fall into this trap. In regards to the Mitra of Vedic and Avestan religion, this god has very, very little to do with the mystery god Mithras, who is worshipped by the Roman legions. So, if you want to look into this Greco-Vedic divine ancestry stuff yourself, don't fall into this pitfall. An article which might be of interest to you is called A Light from Distant Asterisks, towards a description of the Indo-European religious heritage by Peter Jackson, the linguist, not the guy who maintains the rotation of the earth by perennially causing Tolkien to spin in his grave. Anyways, something worth noting along these lines is that the Vedic pantheon is not quite as blessed as windswept, cloud-girt Olympus. Indra was said to have parted the earth and skies in a similar fashion to Saturn's castration of Cronus, and this sets the stage for conflict between good and evil gods. The idea in Greece was that the gods on Olympus were deathless, ambrosial, indifferent, and really unconcerned about human affairs once Zeus had brought some semblance of order to the cosmos. Indian cosmology was far more chaotic, however. I even tend to think that this was a factor which contributed to the world weariness of those attracted to Buddhism and Jainism, since the idea was that when you die, you reincarnate, and then it's just more of the same. Even if you ascend to godhood and go live the beatific life in some sort of pocket plane, you'd still wind up having to battle with great demons and fight celestial wars. Even the gods partake in samsara, and enlightenment, or isolation, were ways of getting off the ride. Two gods I've said very little about, Shiva and Vishnu, who would come into a position of much greater importance at a later date. They weren't really all that important in pre-classical India. But this leads me to an important point. Within any given hymn or sacrifice or festival or whatever, the god in question is in and of himself supreme. Every god, lowercase g, is God, uppercase G. We might call this belief henotheism, or one god at a time-ism, instead of polytheism. And this concept began at a quite early period in Indian history, only to carry on well into our current times. So, I think that's all I want to say about the Vedic element of Indian religion. I just want to remind everybody that although this collection of Vedic hymns is very useful to historians, we can ultimately yield little accurate information from them about the time before 600 BC. They are less important as historical documents and more important as a sort of rudder which shaped Indian society to come. Hinduism would ultimately develop from the collision between the Veda-chanting Brahmin and the indigenous pre-Indo-European conceptions of spirituality. Alright, so I want to talk about Buddhism for a minute, but keep in mind that the real meat and potatoes of Buddhist history lies just outside the reach of where we're at chronologically. We've got a lot left to cover before we get into things like the split between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism, and so on. And Of course, we've already covered the story of the Buddha in some detail, so here I'd like to talk more about the immediate history of Buddhism following the death of Gautama Buddha and set the stage for Buddhism's ascendancy as a world religion. Buddhism's so-called classical period begins around the 1st century AD, and it's during this period that it spreads into China, Korea, and eventually Japan. We'll talk more about the successive phases of Buddhism as we come to them, but for now, let's focus our attention on the period following that final meal of mushrooms which destroyed the Buddha's body and liberated him from his mortal coil. After this fateful dinner, it would be wrong to think of him as either existing or not existing, or both, or neither. Let me repeat that. It would be wrong to think of the Buddha, after his enlightenment, as either existing or not existing, or both, or neither. His followers cremated his remains, his relics were carried off to the ends of the earth, and if you look at certain pieces of Buddhist art which depict that great wheel, you'll often see the Buddhas sitting in their lotus position just outside of samsara, usually in the top right and left corners of the image, where they simultaneously are and are not. Now, the Buddha had made no provisions for a successor during his lifetime. The new leader was to be the Dharma itself, the teaching which he'd left behind. The Sangha, a rather loose term for an initially very loose body of individuals, ultimately conglomerated around the Buddha's teachings. These individuals were typically monks, nuns, hermits, shamanas, and so forth, and some were recluses and others were missionaries. The latter rubbed shoulders with Brahmins, Jains, Ajivika monks, and so forth, while the hermits kind of just did their thing. Individuals like these throughout all of India met together to ultimately form a wide variety of small monastic communities where they could eat and meditate together, debate matters of doctrines, clarify their philosophical footings, and so forth. It's during this period that Buddhism really began to take form as a quote-unquote religion, a thing that binds people together, rather than one man's philosophy on how to escape suffering through the middle path. From this point on, it would not be very long until Buddhism was taken up as a state religion of sorts, but first we need to address a very important event, and that would be none other than the coming of Alexander the Great onto the scene. So, after Alexander had conquered the Achaemenid Persians and part of Afghanistan, the Greek king, and now Persian Shah, moved his eyes toward India, which was really nothing less than some sort of mythical Atlantean kingdom as far as Alexander was concerned. In 326, Alexander fought at the Battle of Hydaspes with the Indian king Porus, and there he gained a great deal of respect as a military leader. Not long after this victory, however, Alexander was finally persuaded by his troops to return home rather than march further into the interiors of the Indian subcontinent and face its harsh climate. This battle around the Jhelum River against King Porus was considered by many to be the most costly battle that the armies of Alexander had up to date fought, and it seems that his men at this point had had enough. The truth is, they were scared shitless to face more Indian armies. Despite being wounded himself on campaign, Alexander had wanted to subjugate the entire known world, which was presumed to end with India. But obviously this was too much to ask for, so despite his relatively brief stay in India, Alexander opened up the whole land for the arrival of Hellenism, and this collision of two such magnificent cultures would yield fascinating results. This Hellenism would first be felt in the realm of politics. When Alexander withdrew from India, he left his conquered Indian territories to the control of some of his generals, and this decision is what ultimately paved the way for the rise of the famous Maurya dynasty, who would be extremely pivotal in the history of Buddhism as a world religion. While returning westward and even considering the conquests of both Carthage and Rome, Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323. We've discussed this. 2 years after Alexander's death, however, one young, ambitious man by the name of Chandragupta Maurya would liberate India's northwestern frontier from Greek control and found himself a dynasty in whose ranks stood some of India's greatest kings of all time. Chandragupta himself, Bindusara, and the famous Buddhist ruler, Emperor Ashoka. Frankly, I have no idea how this is properly pronounced. I've heard Asoka, Ashoka, Ashka, Aska. I don't speak Sanskrit, so I really don't know what the correct pronunciation is, so bear with me. But all three of these kings maintained intimate relationships with the Hellenistic kingdoms to the west. In fact, Chandragupta even wound up marrying the daughters of Seleucus Nicator, the Greek successor king over Syria and a former general of Alexander's armies. This relationship was even further reinforced during the reign of Bindusara, wherein we have records that King Antiochus was urged to send Greek wine and raisins, which had come into great demand in India. So we know there was a whole bunch of trading going on during the Hellenistic period. And we should all know by this point that, like I said earlier, wherever material goods flow, so too do ideas. The diplomatic relationship between India and the West was recorded in one of Ashoka's rock edicts, number 13 to be precise, wherein he mentions the names of 5 Greek rulers to whose kingdoms Buddhist missionaries had been sent. Even just plain old visitors between India and the West became a more common sight. Contact between Greeks and Indians is recorded in great detail in works like Strabo's Geography, Pliny's Natural History, Arrian's Indica, Ptolemy's Geography, and a handful of other classical works. There are even references to quote-unquote conversions of Greeks to Hinduism. Of course, this transition would have been seamless to Greek pagan. It would have occurred purely through a natural syncretic process. It was a matter of taking on a number of new gods in addition to old ones, rather than switching over wholesale. Perhaps a more exceptional case would be the Greek king of Bactria, Menander, or Melinda, Chandragupta's grandson, who took up Buddhism and wrote a great dialogue on the illusion of the self. I suggest you go read it. So it was in this way that India and all of its intellectual richness had come to occupy a peripheral, albeit an important position in the Greek world, and vice versa, of course. The Greeks' influence upon the cultural life of India in the fields of art, architecture, philosophy, and science cannot be understated. This is really an under-researched field due to linguistic hurdles, but the influence the Greeks had upon India was enormous. I plan to have a guest on sometime soon, Dr. Nirmal Das, to come and talk to us about it, but for now you'll just have to deal with my assessment. So let's start with art. The impact of Hellenistic art in India was tremendous, resulting in an entirely new school of art known as the Gandhara school, named after that region northwest of India we now call Afghanistan. This style actually originated in Bactria and Parthia, And it was only a matter of time until local artists began to construct Buddhist images with Greek techniques. Chiefly, this style was focused on realistic images of the Buddha or other bodhisattvas made of stone or stucco. You'll often hear this referred to as Greco-Buddhist art. This was as much the product of an eastward expansion of Hellenism as it was with a westward expansion of Indian civilization. As one art historian put it, the Gandhara artist had the hands of a Greek and the heart of an Indian. Highly polished images of the Buddha were being made, which had more in common with, let's say, the Greek god Apollo than with any Indian conception of this venerable man. Interestingly enough, these images were seated in the typical Indian lotus posture, which was actually based more on observations of Indian ascetics rather than on any Western philosophers, who were more into walking and reclining than sitting, if we use either a Socrates or a Diogenes as our model. And this leads me to my next point, which concerns the collision of each culture's respective philosophies. And this is where it gets really murky, because we have no clear idea of who influenced who in regards to what. Greek mystical philosophy, as seen, let's say, in the Orphic and Pythagorean schools, for example, they have a great number of parallels with Indian philosophy that I honestly don't know who got what from whom. And I've heard countless arguments on all sides. Orientalists, nationalists, and so forth all have their own opinions. I've heard it said that metempsychosis, or reincarnation, was brought into India by Greek travelers starting from about the 8th century. You've probably heard far more often the opposite to also be true, especially when it comes to theosophical circles. The reality is, however, that we have no way of knowing, and ultimately it might just be that the philosophers of both cultures independently developed their respective theories of metempsychosis. We just don't have the sources to make a strong argument either way. There's all sorts of great questions we can ask, like, did Stoicism and Epicureanism inform Buddhism? Or did Buddhism inform Stoicism and Epicureanism? Or were they completely separate developments which only converged to influence one another at a later date? Since so much of history is retroprojection, does quote-unquote at a later date even mean anything? In other words, how did eventual developments in both streams reinterpret old information in the light of new information? What about vegetarianism? What about the concept of the self? Concepts like the Parmenidean, Platonic, or Neoplatonic one in relation to Brahma? What about astrology or alchemy? The number of questions is endless, and as far as I'm concerned, there's no way of untangling this mess of a non-simultaneously apprehended universe. Sorry. As far as Indian science is concerned, the Greeks radically changed India's thoughts concerning astronomy. Thanks to Alexander, the Greeks were the inheritors of that glorious Babylonian, Egyptian, and Persian cultural heritage, and their millennia of observations went a long way in influencing the Indians. As far as I know, Vedic astrology was heavily concerned with the transit of the moon through its 27 mansions, and it was far more lunar than it was solar. However, the signs of the zodiac, the 7-day week, the concept of hours, all of these things were brought into India by the Greeks, who themselves also gained much from Indian observations, things like mansions. By the Middle Ages, however, Indians took a sort of mystical place of prominence in all matters astrological. Western Europe looked to the Arab world for authority, and the Arab world looked to India. There was a sort of never-ending Orientalism when it came to deciding who were the supreme race of astrologers. The Picatrix is a great example of this, since it was originally written by an Arab, and it's brimming with references to great Indian sages who were masters of astrology, fumigation, image-making, and so forth. But anyhow, this is just an aside. I don't plan on moving much further eastward from here, because if we do, we're getting into murkier territory as far as my own ability to relate anything accurate or meaningful is concerned. And there's a number of reasons for this, both historical and linguistic. When it comes to India, we Western folk can recognize all sorts of parallels with the traditions of our own pre-Christian ancestors, and even the language is not impenetrable. But when it comes to China, Japan, Korea, Polynesia, and so forth, I'd really be talking about what scholars call reception, since everything I know about China, for example, comes from narratives and recreations made by white Angloid scholars during the 19th and 20th centuries, not from Chinese people themselves. There's just only so many languages one person can learn. I haven't the faintest clue what primitive religion was like in China or Japan, beyond the fact that it probably had many affinities with Central Asian shamanism, or just shamanism in general. Animism, ancestor worship, divination through bones and hexagrams, dance, drumming, the use of sacred plants, and so forth. It was these sort of things which dominated much of East Asia until the coming of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so forth. Now, as far as the specifics of Taoism or Taoism is concerned, I'll let it speak for itself. Go find a copy of the Tao Te Ching and consume it in various translations, please. You can finish it in an afternoon, or you can read it piece by piece. It doesn't matter. But I really do think it's one of mankind's most important texts. It is most universal in its wisdom, which is why I don't even really like calling Taoism a religion. Sometimes I even like to play a bit and call it the revelation of Hermes Trismegistus to the Chinese, because Hermeticism and Taoism have so much in common, albeit being completely independent developments from one another. All this is neither here nor there, though, since my project is admittedly Eurocentric in nature. It can be no other way given who I am and what I am. So with that said, I think we'll leave India for now, remembering that from this point onward in our chronology, it's officially become intertwined with the greater Mediterranean system, and it's now prone to giving and receiving influence from that particular corner of the earth. The Hellenistic world will be intimately bound up with India for the next few hundred years, and the result of that bond will rub off on the Roman Empire in centuries to come. Ultimately, Rome will be cut off from India by local uprisings in formerly Seleucid regions in Persia, but that's a long ways away from now, so we'll leave it at that. This has been the 31st installment of Encyclopedia Hermetica. I'm Dan Natrell, and I'd like to thank you for joining me for this rather cursory overview of pre-classical Indian civilization. Thank you.